Hello there, welcome back. You know, I'm not the sort of person who likes to see things just brushed under the carpet, swept away and forgotten about. Certainly not when they have been as big and dramatic and life-changing and world-changing as the COVID pandemic. And yet we've all got on with our lives, haven't we, as if that never happened. Feels like a distant memory now when we were locked in our houses and forced to wear masks. Feels like a distant memory that once upon a time, if you asserted that probably that virus didn't just, I don't know, manage to leap around various species in a Chinese wet market and somehow infect the whole world, but could have possibly been the result of various experiments in a viral lab just up the road, you would have been called a conspiracy theorist, a racist, a xenophobe, a nutter. If you tried putting that on social media, you'd probably be banned from it. And it was obvious. I remember on my old show at the channel of which we do not speak, I spoke about this regularly with leading experts who knew all about splicing bits and bobs onto viruses, and said to me, look, this is my field of work. I've looked at this virus myself in a lab and I can basically see the stitch marks on that thing. This is not performing like any virus that spreads zoonotically. The zoonotic transfer just wouldn't have happened like this anyway. This is utterly ludicrous. And we spoke about that a lot on my show in a previous life. And indeed, at the time, I spoke to the man we're going to speak to now, Lord Matt Ridley, the author of Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. He's a former Conservative peer. Before we speak to Matt, the reason this topic has cropped up in today's news agenda is because Boris Johnson, of course, Prime Minister, at the peak of COVID, has been speaking about COVID being made a lab on Stephen Bartlett's podcast, A Secret Diary of a CEO. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Why were they messing around with a virus in a lab in Wuhan?
Well, you may well ask. I mean, I think they were in.
Why do you think they were? As someone that is so far away from why people do such a thing.
I genuinely don't know, but I think that they were, you know, science, the point of science is to keep pushing back the frontiers of human knowledge everywhere and to see what they could do.
Do you think it was a weapon?
I didn't have any reason to think so. I didn't have any reason to think so. I think it was a terrible accident. I think the thing escaped from the lab. I think they were looking at engineering these viruses, just looking at function gain of the virus and ways that they could manipulate it. And sadly, something went wrong.
The problem is we were lied to. We were told repeatedly that this lab had come out of a wet market, that it was something to do with a bat and then, I don't know, some pangolin or something, and that someone had caught it in the wet market and got sick and it had spread, and then that person had got on an aeroplane, then we all had it and we all had to wear masks and we had to go along with that. We were told repeatedly this did not come out of a lab, and if you dared speculate that it did, you were called a nutcase. You were banned, you were ostracised from polite society, you were kicked off social media, and they lied to us. And the problem now, of course, is when you realise you've been lied to, all other speculation about what was really going on in that Wuhan virology lab, however ridiculous it may be, anything seems plausible now because we know we were lied to anyway. So what was going on in that blimmin' lab? Was it an accidental release? Could it have been actually something far more sinister? And what about the response? If this thing had been part made in a lab, surely we would have known, or they should have known, how to respond to it, and yet we were all locked in our houses. I think there's a whole lot of this story which is still not being told. Let's speak now to Lord Matt Ridley. Matt, talk to me about this Wuhan virology lab. I remember at the time when I was digging around into this, it's an interesting thing. It's not only China in that lab, is it? As far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Michel Barnier helped open part of it at one point. Anthony Fauci apparently has connections to this laboratory. What is it and what was going on in there?
Right. Well, it's a very good question. Pretty well exactly 5 years ago this week, we think the accident happened. I mean, around this time, sometime in October 2019, an accident happened in a lab. It was a slow burn to start with. It then got out into the market and blew up. Now, how do we know that? Because we've gone back through the family tree of the various strains of the virus and worked out when it first emerged into humans. We know it was extremely well adapted to humans from the start, which most zoonotic jumps are not. And we then found out what they were up to in this lab, which, as you say, was gobsmacking. You're right that the French were involved in building the biosafety level 4 lab, which is the ultra-safe lab, and it was China's first and at the time only BSL-4 lab. French were involved in building it. They fell out with the Chinese because Chinese broke the promises about how much the French could be involved in operating it. But actually that's irrelevant, because the experiments they were doing that we're worried about were being done at biosafety level 2, not even biosafety level 3. Now that is, it's not much more than what you and I are doing now. You might wear a mask or something like that, but basically you're just being a little bit careful in a lab at biosafety level 2. And that is simply not safe for viruses like this. Why were they doing it? Boris was asked the question. He gave actually a perfectly good answer. They wanted to advance science. They were desperately trying to keep up with the University of North Carolina, which had pioneered some brilliant ways of splicing genes into and out of coronaviruses, particularly these SARS-like beta coronaviruses. And this was the only lab in the world, apart from North Carolina, that was doing that. There are 40,000 wet markets in China. There was one lab that was doing this, and it was right next door to where this virus broke out. And they don't seem to have had a motive beyond understanding these viruses, predicting the next pandemic. Well, that went well, didn't it? And to some extent, they had ambitions to make a vaccine that would work against all coronaviruses. That seems to have been the ultimate motive.
So at least we can be reassured, because like I said, into a vacuum, and especially the vacuum that's being created by deliberate cover-ups, grows many a conspiracy theory that spreads faster than the coronavirus. But at least perhaps you're suggesting we can be reassured that this research was not nefarious. It was actually potentially for the greater good, trying to master coronaviruses and knowing how to fight them in the future through vaccination. But the problem with the cover-up is the cover-up, in my mind, led to an approach to this virus that was far too heavy-handed, the ramifications of which we're still suffering today. And I think, more than anything, it really led to a huge breakdown in trust of one section of the population and their governments.
Yeah, and actually, just to go back on what you said a moment ago, while the intention may have been good, actually this was a really dumb way of predicting pandemics and preventing them. It was far more likely to lead to one. And a number of leading scientists said so at the time. In the run-up to this, there was a meeting between the Royal Society and the National Academies in which they discussed the Wuhan Institute of Virology and said the work they're doing is really quite risky. And other scientists wrote to the EcoHealth Alliance, which was this US-based organization run by a British scientist, which was funneling American taxpayers' money to Wuhan, and said, your explanation for why you need to do this research makes no sense at all. In fact, it's more likely to cause a problem than to solve a problem. I happen to know, because I was talking to people in Number 10 at the time, that they were being urged by both the scientists and the espionage agents, the intelligence service is the word I'm looking for, to reject publicly any possibility of a lab leak. And I was one of the people they consulted. They said, should we do this? And I said, no, you should not.
Why would it be in our interest, if it's coming from our own intelligence agencies and our own scientists, to reject the idea it could have been a lab leak? How would that have helped?
Well, there was considerable concern at the time within the university sector, and there is still now, that the Chinese won't collaborate, won't fund work, won't send students, won't send other scientists to the West, and that the financial dependence of our scientific community on Chinese collaboration is now huge.
But surely we should want to make China a pariah in the scientific community if they're messing about, splicing into coronaviruses at safety level 2, releasing it into society, creating a pandemic that killed millions of people, ruined the international economy, covered it up, refused to cooperate. I mean, surely instead of going, we can't upset them in case they don't want to work with us anymore, we should be saying, get out.
Well, this is the thing a lot of us find very puzzling, because when the Chinese broke the custom, it wasn't yet a rule, that you don't genetically engineer human beings about 5 or 6 years ago, the world scientific community reacted with horror when it turned out that one scientist had done this. They prosecuted him, they jailed him, they said, I'm terribly sorry, we won't allow that to happen again, it shouldn't have happened. Now, in this case, they've been brazen in saying, no, it wasn't us, it probably came from frozen lobsters from Maine or something. They had weird theories they were trying to float around to deflect us. And you're being racist in suggesting it. Well, actually, to suggest it came out of one of their wet markets might be just as racist, if that's the card you want to play, as it were. So the craven attitude of the Western scientific community to investigating this, refusing to investigate this, essentially. There's been very, very little attempt by Western scientists to dig into this, except for a few brave and rather lonely people, most of whom are working outside the mainstream funding sector, because in America, they're terrified of what Anthony Fauci's institute will do if they look into this. And in Britain, likewise, the Wellcome Trust. Jeremy Farrar pinned his colours to the mast very early on, and as a result, British scientists know that they've got to keep their head down on this topic.
But Matt, I could talk to you for ages about this. This is so fascinating. I've got to go to advert break. Let's get you back on really soon, because I actually want to continue this conversation. Like I said, I don't think we should brush these huge issues under the carpet. Sadly, though, I'm actually running out of time.